"You're throwing your life away, Elena," my mother said, her voice cutting through the noise of Sunday dinner at my parents' Upper West Side brownstone, and I watched as every conversation at the table stopped, all eyes turning toward me with that familiar mixture of concern and judgment I'd learned to recognize over 26 years of being the Rodriguez family disappointment. I sat there, fork frozen halfway to my mouth, the expensive osso buco my father had insisted on ordering growing cold on my plate, while my mother continued, "Columbia Law School, Elena, do you understand what you're giving up?" My brother Marcus, golden child, Harvard Law graduate, now a corporate attorney at one of Manhattan's most prestigious firms, leaned back in his chair with that smirk I'd seen my entire life, the one that said he was about to enjoy watching me squirm. I'd always been second to Marcus. Always. When I brought home a 98 on a test, he'd already scored a 100. When I got into Columbia Law, he reminded everyone he'd gone to Harvard. When I made law review, he'd already made partner track at Morrison and Fletcher LLP. My father set down his wine glass with deliberate precision, the kind of gesture he used in his accounting firm when he was about to deliver bad news to a client, and said, "We've invested nearly $100,000 in your education, Elena. 2 years of tuition, your apartment in Morningside Heights, your expenses. This isn't just your life you're wasting, it's our money." I felt my chest tighten, that familiar sensation of being small and insufficient that had followed me through childhood, through high school, through my first year of law school when I'd wake up at 3 a.m. with panic attacks, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. But they didn't know my secret. For the past 18 months, while I'd been sitting through constitutional law and civil procedure, while I'd been briefing cases and participating in moot court, I'd been building something else entirely. LegalEase, an AI-powered legal tech platform that could automate contract review for small businesses, something that had started as a frustration during my summer internship when I'd spent 80 hours reviewing boilerplate contracts that any decent algorithm could have processed in minutes. My best friend and co-founder Jen, a computer science PhD dropout from MIT, and I had been coding until 2 a.m. most nights, building the prototype, testing it with small business owners in Brooklyn and Queens who couldn't afford $400 an hour attorneys. We had 12 beta users. We had revenue. We had something real. But sitting there at that table, looking at my mother's disappointed face and my father's anger and Marcus's condescending smile, I realized something had crystallized inside me during this dinner. I was done living their version of my life. I was done pretending that the path they'd chosen for me was the path I wanted. The decision settled into my bones with a certainty I'd never felt before, and I knew that everything was about to change. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. I set down my fork with a steadiness that surprised me, looked around the table at these people who had shaped my entire life, and said in a voice that didn't waver, "I'm leaving Columbia Law School, effective immediately, and I'm not going to change my mind." My mother's face crumpled like I'd physically struck her, her hand flying to her chest in that dramatic gesture she'd perfected over decades of guilt-tripping her children, and she actually started crying, real tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, while my father's complexion turned a dangerous shade of red that meant his blood pressure was spiking. "You're what?" he said, his voice starting quiet but building with each word. "You're throwing away a 6-figure career, a degree from one of the top 3 law schools in the country, throwing away everything we've sacrificed for you, and you're doing this now, in the middle of your second year?" Marcus started laughing, actually laughing, that condescending chuckle that had accompanied every one of my failures since childhood, and he leaned forward with his elbows on the table, his $3,000 suit jacket bunching at the shoulders, and said, "Let me guess, you're going to find yourself, or start some little project that'll be bankrupt in 3 months, and then you'll come crawling back in 6 months, maybe a year tops, begging Dad to call in favors to get you readmitted." My Aunt Patricia, My mother's sister, who had never worked a day in her life, but somehow felt qualified to judge everyone else's career choices, set down her wine glass with a sharp click and said, "This is what happens when you coddle children, when you don't teach them about responsibility and commitment. Elena, this is the most irresponsible, selfish thing I've ever heard." Around the table, I could see the other relatives exchanging glances, some pitying, some judgmental, all of them already writing the story of my failure in their minds, already preparing the "I told you so" conversations they'd have at next year's dinner. But then I noticed my cousin Sophia, just 19, home from her first year at Rutgers, and she wasn't looking at me with pity or judgment, but with something that looked almost like curiosity, maybe even admiration. And when our eyes met, she gave me the smallest nod, like she understood something the rest of them didn't. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and said, "I'm moving out of the Morningside Heights apartment this weekend. I'll have everything cleared out by Sunday night, and I want to be clear that this isn't a phase or a breakdown or whatever story you're all going to tell yourselves. This is me choosing my own path." My father stood too, his napkin falling from his lap to the floor, and he said in that cold, controlled voice he used when he was truly angry, "If you walk away from this opportunity, Elena, don't expect us to catch you when you fall. Don't expect us to pay for you to go back. Don't expect anything from this family, because we're done enabling your irresponsibility." I picked up my purse, looked one more time at Marcus's smirking face, at my mother's tears, at my father's rigid disappointment, and I walked out of that brownstone into the cool October evening, and by the following weekend I'd moved into a tiny studio apartment in Astoria, Queens, 400 square feet, that cost $1,400 a month, every piece of furniture from Craigslist or the curb, and I'd never felt more terrified or more free in my entire life. The first 6 months after I left law school were the hardest months of my life, harder than any exam period, harder than my worst days of childhood being compared to Marcus, because this time I had chosen the difficulty and I had no one to blame but myself when I sat in my Astoria studio at 2 a.m. eating my fourth package of chicken-flavored ramen that week, my laptop burning hot on my thighs, while Jen and I debugged code over video chat, both of us exhausted and running on coffee, and the stubborn refusal to admit that maybe, possibly, my family had been right. I was still in the Rodriguez family group chat, and I made the mistake of not muting it, so I saw every message, every photo of Marcus closing another deal, every announcement of cousin accomplishments, and worst of all, I saw the messages that mentioned me, like when my uncle Roberto shared an article about law school dropout rates and said, "Some people just aren't cut out for the rigor." Or when Aunt Patricia posted something about the importance of finishing what you start with a pointed emoji that I knew was meant for me. Marcus sent me job postings every few weeks, associate positions at mid-tier firms, paralegal positions, even a legal secretary opening once, and each email had the same subject line, "For when you come to your senses," and I wanted to block him, but some masochistic part of me needed to see it, needed to remember what I was proving wrong. But I had Jen, brilliant, crazy Jen, who had walked away from her own PhD program at MIT because she believed in our vision more than she believed in academic credentials, and we would sit in coffee shops all over Queens and Brooklyn, nursing single cups of coffee for 4 hours while we worked, our table covered in notebooks and charging cables. And she would look up sometimes and say, "We're going to make it, E, I can feel it." And I desperately wanted to believe her even when my bank account dropped below $200 and I started doing freelance document review at night just to make rent. Then in month 4, something shifted. Professor Michaels, my contracts professor from Columbia, the one instructor who had actually seemed interested in my AI project when I'd mentioned it during office hours, reached out asking to meet for coffee, and when we sat down in a Starbucks near campus, he said he'd been thinking about our conversation, had done some research into legal tech, and he wanted to invest $150,000 in LegalEase in exchange for 8% equity. And I remember my hands shaking so hard I almost couldn't hold my coffee cup, while he explained that he'd made money in early Facebook stock and was looking for promising startups. And this was the validation I needed, not from my family, but from someone who understood both law and potential. We used that funding to build out the real prototype, the enterprise-grade version that could handle complex contract analysis, that could integrate with existing legal software, that could save small businesses thousands of dollars in legal fees. And by month 6, we had something that actually worked. Something that business owners in Brooklyn were paying us $50 a month to use. And I was still eating ramen, and my studio apartment was still tiny, and I was still exhausted all the time. But for the first time since I'd walked out of that family dinner, I felt like maybe I hadn't made the biggest mistake of my life. I almost didn't go to Thanksgiving that year, 8 months after I'd walked out of law school, 8 months of grinding poverty and endless work. But some pathetic part of me still hoped that maybe they'd see I was serious. Maybe they'd ask how things were going. Maybe someone would acknowledge that I was still trying, still fighting, still their daughter and sister and niece. I arrived at my parents' Westchester home at 3 p.m., the driveway already packed with my uncle's Mercedes and my aunt's Lexus and Marcus's new BMW that probably cost more than I'd made in the entire 8 months since I'd left school. And when I walked in carrying the pumpkin pie I'd splurged on from Trader Joe's, my mother glanced up from the kitchen and said, "Oh, Elena, you're here, just put that on the counter," and then immediately turned back to my Aunt Patricia without asking me a single question about my life. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, invisible, watching my mother and aunt discuss Marcus's recent promotion, how proud they were, how he was the youngest junior partner in his firm's history, and when I tried to join the conversation, my mother just handed me a stack of plates and said, "Make yourself useful and set the table." The dining room was full of relatives. 23 people crammed around the extended table, and I ended up at the far end next to my teenage cousin, who spent the entire meal on his phone. And from my seat, I could see Marcus holding court at the other end, his girlfriend Rachel beside him, beautiful and polished, and everything my family thought a successful woman should be. When my father stood to make his traditional Thanksgiving toast, he thanked God for the family's blessings, specifically mentioning Marcus's promotion to junior partner at Whitmore and Associates, specifically mentioning my cousin Daniel's new sales job, specifically mentioning my uncle Roberto's investment success. And then his eyes passed right over me like I wasn't even there, like I'd already been erased from the family narrative. Then Marcus stood up, pulling Rachel to her feet beside him, and announced they were engaged, and the room erupted in celebration, everyone standing and hugging and crying happy tears, and my mother actually sobbed with joy while she embraced her golden child, and when Rachel extended her hand to show off the ring, easily 3 carats, my aunt said, "This is what success looks like. This is what happens when you make smart choices and work hard." And I knew that comment was meant for me, even though no one was looking in my direction. My mother spent 15 minutes introducing Rachel to every single relative, asking about her job at the consulting firm, admiring her outfit, discussing wedding plans, and she walked right past me twice without saying a word, without asking how I was doing, without acknowledging that I existed. My father made pointed comments throughout dinner about real careers and real success and the importance of stability in this uncertain economy, and each comment landed like a stone in my chest because I knew he was talking about me, talking to me without actually addressing me directly. And when my uncle Roberto mentioned that his friend's daughter had just made partner at a major firm and said, "Now that's what a Columbia education should lead to," I felt something inside me crack. I left before dessert was served, mumbling something about not feeling well, and no one tried to stop me. No one followed me out. No one even seemed to notice when I grabbed my coat from the hall closet and walked out into the cold November evening. I sat in my beat-up Honda Civic in my parents' driveway for 10 minutes, crying so hard I couldn't see, crying because I'd known it would be bad, but I hadn't expected to feel so completely erased, so utterly dismissed. And then my phone buzzed with a text from Jen. "How's it going?" And I wrote back, "They don't even see me anymore." And her response came immediately, "They'll see." We're going to make it. I promise you, E. They're going to see. The months after Thanksgiving blurred together into an endless cycle of coffee shop tables sticky with spilled lattes, networking events, where I smiled until my face hurt while pitching LegalEase to skeptical small business owners who wanted to know why they should trust a law school dropout with their contracts, and late nights debugging code while Jen fell asleep on video chat, and I kept working because stopping meant thinking about how my family group chat had lit up with photos of Marcus and Rachel's engagement party, an elaborate affair at some Manhattan rooftop venue that probably cost more than my entire annual budget, and not one person had asked if I was coming or even acknowledged that I existed. But something was shifting, slowly, like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of my life, because by month 10, we had our first 50 paying customers, small businesses across Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx paying us $90 a month to automate their contract reviews, to save them the $300 hourly rates that lawyers like Marcus charged. And I lived for the messages from these customers telling us we'd save their business thousands of dollars, that we were making legal protection accessible to people who couldn't afford traditional law firms. I was still working from coffee shops, still wearing the same 3 outfits in rotation, still eating more ramen than any human should consume, but our revenue had grown to $4,950 a month by month 11. And I remember the day it crossed $5,000 because that was the first time since leaving law school that I could pay my rent, buy groceries, and have money left over. Not much, maybe $200, but it felt like a fortune. Then TechCrunch ran a small piece, barely 3 paragraphs, about promising legal tech startups to watch, and LegalEase was mentioned third in a list of 5 companies. And I screenshot that article and stared at it for 20 minutes before I did something stupid and posted it in the Rodriguez family group chat with the message, "We got some press." And I watched the read receipts pile up, watched my mother and father and Marcus and Aunt Patricia and Uncle Roberto all read the message, and not one of them responded, not even an emoji, just silence, and that silence told me everything I needed to know about what they thought of my little project. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed with a private message from Marcus. "Call me when you have a real job." And I sat in the Starbucks on Steinway Street and cried angry tears while the barista pretended not to notice. But then I opened my laptop and looked at our dashboard showing $5,000 in monthly recurring revenue. 50 customers who were paying us and trusting us and building their businesses with our help. And I took a screenshot of that dashboard too, but this one I didn't share with anyone except Jen, and I saved it in a folder on my computer labeled Receipts, because some part of me knew I was going to need evidence of every step of this journey, proof that I hadn't been crazy or stupid or irresponsible, proof that I'd been building something real while they were all laughing at me. Month 14 arrived with an email that made my hands shake so badly I had to set down my coffee. And the subject line read, "Enterprise Demo Request, Morrison and Fletcher, LLP." And I knew that name, knew it was one of the top 20 corporate law firms in Manhattan, the kind of white shoe establishment that charged $800 an hour and represented Fortune 500 companies, and they wanted to test our enterprise version of LegalEase for potential firm-wide implementation. Jen and I spent 3 days preparing the pitch, refining our presentation, running through every possible question they might ask, and the potential contract was worth $500,000 annually, more money than I'd made in my entire life, more than our current revenue multiplied by 8. And this was the kind of client that would legitimize us, that would prove LegalEase wasn't just for small businesses, but could handle the complexity of major corporate legal work. The morning of the pitch, I put on my one good suit, the Navy Theory pantsuit I'd bought on sale back when I thought I'd be a lawyer, and I took the subway into Manhattan, walked into the glass tower on Park Avenue, and rode the elevator to the 43rd floor where Morrison and Fletcher occupied an entire level of pristine white marble and dark wood paneling that screamed old money and established power. The receptionist led me to a conference room where 7 partners sat around a table, 6 men and 1 woman, all of them older than my parents, all of them looking at me with the polite skepticism that successful people show young entrepreneurs who are asking them to trust something new. And I was setting up my laptop when the managing partner walked in, Richard Hastings, silver-haired and imposing, and he shook my hand and said, "Elena Rodriguez, any relation to Miguel Rodriguez?" And my stomach dropped because Miguel Rodriguez was my father's name. I said yes, he's my father, trying to keep my voice steady, and Richard smiled and said, "We play golf together at Winged Foot. Wonderful man. I had no idea his daughter was behind LegalEase. And I felt anxiety flood through me because this changed everything. Because if the pitch went badly, Richard would tell my father, would tell him his dropout daughter had embarrassed herself in front of serious lawyers, would confirm everything my family believed about my poor judgment. And if the pitch went well, if we actually got this contract, Richard would tell my father before I had a chance to. And I wasn't ready for my family to know how well things were going, because something in me wanted to wait until the success was so undeniable they couldn't diminish it or claim it was luck. But I couldn't back out now, couldn't show the fear that was clawing at my throat. So I launched into the presentation, walking them through how LegalEase's AI could analyze and flag issues in contracts in seconds instead of hours, how it learned from each firm's specific preferences and past cases, how it didn't replace attorneys but amplified their efficiency, allowing junior associates to do senior-level contract review and freeing up partners for strategic work. And I watched their faces shift from skepticism to interest to genuine engagement. And they asked sharp questions about data security and confidentiality and liability, questions I'd anticipated and prepared for. And by the time I finished the demo, showing them our system catching 3 issues in a sample contract that their associate had missed, the energy in the room had completely transformed. Richard Hastings leaned back in his chair and said, "This is exactly what we need. Our associates are drowning in contract review, and this could save us hundreds of billable hours while improving accuracy." And another partner asked about implementation timeline, and a third wanted to discuss pricing structures. And I realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that this was happening. They were going to sign. And when the meeting ended 90 minutes later, Richard walked me to the elevator and said, "I'll be mentioning this to your father at our next golf game. He must be incredibly proud of what you've built." And I smiled and thanked him, and managed to hold myself together until I got outside onto Park Avenue. And then I called Jen and said, "They're going to sign. They're actually going to sign." And she screamed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. And then I stood on that Manhattan sidewalk in my one good suit and thought about how my father would find out, would hear from his golf buddy that his failure daughter had just landed a $500,000 contract with one of the most prestigious law firms in New York. And I felt vindication and terror in equal measure, because this was it. This was the beginning of everything changing, and there would be no going back to being invisible. The contract with Morrison and Fletcher was signed 3 weeks later, and when the DocuSign notification hit my inbox at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, I stared at my laptop screen in the coffee shop that had become my unofficial office and felt something shift in my chest, something that felt like vindication and terror and pure disbelief all mixed together, because this was real. This was $500,000 in annual recurring revenue, and suddenly, LegalEase wasn't a scrappy startup anymore, but a legitimate business with a major corporate client. And within 48 hours, my inbox exploded with inquiries from 2 other major Manhattan law firms, Silverman and Cobb and Richards Whitmore Associates, both wanting demos because word traveled fast in the legal world, and nobody wanted to be left behind when their competitors were adopting transformative technology. Jen and I met with a venture capital firm called Harbinger Ventures 3 weeks after Morrison and Fletcher signed, and I walked into their Soho offices expecting another round of polite skepticism, but instead the managing partner, a woman named Catherine Wu, who'd built and sold 2 successful companies, looked at our numbers and said, "We want to lead your Series A." And just like that, we were negotiating a $3 million investment at an $8 million valuation. And I had to excuse myself to go to the bathroom, where I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection, and thought about Marcus's message telling me to call him when I had a real job, thought about my father's dismissive comments about wasting their money, thought about Thanksgiving dinner, where nobody had asked about my life because they'd all assumed I had nothing worth discussing. The Series A closed in March, 18 months after I'd left Columbia Law, and suddenly I had $3 million in the bank and responsibilities I'd never imagined, hiring decisions and office space to lease and employment contracts to negotiate, and Jen and I found a small office space in Long Island City. Nothing fancy, but real walls and real desks instead of coffee shop tables, and we hired 5 people, 2 engineers, 2 sales associates, and 1 customer success manager, and I conducted the interviews in my one good suit and tried to project confidence while internally panicking that these experienced professionals were trusting me, a 27-year-old law school dropout, with their careers and livelihoods. My father never mentioned Richard Hastings' golf game conversation, never acknowledged that he knew about Morrison and Fletcher, and I didn't bring it up either because some petty part of me wanted him to have to sit with the knowledge that his failure daughter had succeeded without his support or approval, and I kept working 70-hour weeks, even though I could now afford to eat something other than ramen, because every new client and every satisfied customer felt like another piece of evidence in my favor, another receipt to add to my growing collection of proof that I hadn't been crazy or irresponsible, that I'd been right to bet on myself when nobody else would. And the Rodriguez family group chat stayed quiet about my business, because none of them knew just how much had changed, how much I'd built, while they'd been ignoring me. And I wasn't ready to tell them yet, because the success still felt fragile, like something that might disappear if I acknowledged it too loudly, and I wanted to wait until it was so undeniable that even Marcus couldn't diminish it with his condescending tone and his messages about real jobs. Sophia's message came through on a Wednesday afternoon in April, 19 months after I'd walked away from Columbia Law. And it was just 3 words, "Coffee this week?" And I stared at my phone in the Long Island City office where I was reviewing sales projections with Jen. Because Sophia and I hadn't spoken directly since that family dinner where I'd announced I was leaving law school, and I'd assumed she'd written me off like the rest of the family. But I texted back, "Tomorrow, 3 p.m., Cafe Grumpy in Greenpoint?" And she responded immediately with a yes and a coffee cup emoji. And the next day, I walked into the cafe 15 minutes early because I was nervous, because I didn't know if this was some kind of family reconnaissance mission or genuine interest. And when Sophia arrived, she looked different than I remembered, older somehow, her face drawn with stress despite being only 20 years old now, and she hugged me immediately and said, "I've been following everything you're doing, Elena, and it's incredible." And I felt something loosen in my chest because those were words I hadn't heard from anyone in my family, not once in all these months. We sat at a corner table and Sophia told me she was struggling at Stony Brook, studying business because her parents had insisted it was practical. But she was miserable, constantly being compared to Marcus, constantly hearing about how he'd done his undergrad at Cornell and gone straight to law school without wavering, and she said, "They talk about you too, you know, but always as the cautionary tale, the example of what not to do." And I saw my own pain reflected in her eyes, saw the weight of family expectations crushing someone else I cared about. And she asked me about LegalEase, really asked, wanted to know about the technology and the business model and how I'd found investors. And I realized she'd been reading the tech press coverage, had been watching my journey from the outside, while everyone else in the family had been actively ignoring it or mocking it. I told her the truth about the 16-hour days and the rejection and the moments I'd almost given up, about eating ramen for months and sleeping 4 hours a night, and the pitch to Morrison and Fletcher where I'd been terrified I'd fail. And I also told her about the victories, about signing that first $500,000 contract and raising $3 million in Series A funding and hiring real employees and moving into a real office. And Sophia listened with this intensity that reminded me of myself 2 years ago. Hungry and desperate and looking for proof that there was another way besides the path our family had laid out. And when I finished, she said, "I want to work for you. I want to learn from you." And I felt a jolt of recognition because this was exactly what I'd needed when I was drowning at Columbia. someone who believed in a different vision of success, someone who would take me seriously. I offered her a paid internship for the summer, $20 an hour, which was more than I'd paid myself for the first year of LegalEase, and her eyes lit up with something that looked like hope. But then she said, "Can we not tell my parents yet? Can we not tell the family?" And I understood immediately, because she needed this to be hers, needed to prove herself before they could dismiss her or diminish it or use it as another comparison to Marcus. And I said yes, I wouldn't tell anyone. And as we left the cafe and walked toward the subway, I felt something I hadn't felt in almost 2 years. The sense that someone in my family actually saw me, actually understood what I was trying to build and why it mattered. And Sophia looked at me and said, "Thank you for believing in me." And I wanted to tell her that she was saving me too, that having someone from the family witness my work and see its value was healing something I hadn't realized was still broken. But instead, I just hugged her and said, "You're going to be amazing." Sophia started her internship the first week of June, and I watched her dive into the work with the same hungry intensity I recognized from my own early days, learning our technology stack and sitting in on client calls and asking questions that showed she was actually thinking strategically about the business. And 3 weeks into her internship, she came into my office on a Thursday afternoon and closed the door behind her with an expression that told me something was wrong. And when I asked what was going on, she sat down across from my desk and said, "Marcus is having a hard time at his firm." And I felt something cold settle in my stomach because I hadn't thought about my brother in weeks, had been so focused on building LegalEase that the family drama had faded into background noise. And Sophia explained that she'd been at Sunday dinner at my parents' house the previous weekend, that Marcus had shown up looking stressed and tired. And he'd spent the entire meal complaining about how technology companies were ruining the legal profession, how AI was making traditional legal work obsolete, how his firm was losing clients to automated services that charged a fraction of what human attorneys charged. And the irony hit me like a physical blow, because my technology, the platform I'd built, while my family mocked me and dismissed me, was part of what was disrupting Marcus's world, part of what was making his traditional corporate law career less secure. And I sat there processing this information while Sophia watched me carefully and said, "He specifically mentioned contract review automation, Elena. He was talking about companies like yours, even if he doesn't know you're one of them." And I felt a complicated mix of vindication and something that wasn't quite sympathy, but was close to it, because I'd never wanted to hurt Marcus, even after everything he'd said to me. Even after the job postings and the condescending messages and the laughter when I'd announced I was leaving Colombia. Sophia told me that my parents had tried to reassure Marcus, had talked about how he was talented and experienced and would adapt. But she said he'd looked genuinely worried in a way she'd never seen before. And my Aunt Patricia had made some comment about how corporate law was changing, and maybe Marcus should have been more open to innovation, which Sophia noted was rich, coming from the same woman who'd called me irresponsible for pursuing exactly that innovation. And we sat there in my office, while outside the glass walls my employees worked at their desks, and my technology hummed away, disrupting the industry that had seemed so permanent and unshakable when I'd been a miserable law student 2 years ago. The same week Sophia told me about Marcus, we signed 3 more major contracts, including one with a Los Angeles firm called Patterson and Lee for $850,000 annually, and another with a Chicago firm called Bernstein Associates for $650,000 annually. And our third major enterprise client was a boutique Manhattan firm called Crawford and Hastings that specialized in corporate contracts, worth $600,000 annually. And when I calculated our annual recurring revenue with Jen, we realized we just crossed $2.1 million. And the company that my brother had laughed at, that my family had dismissed as a fantasy, was generating more revenue than most small law practices. And I thought about Marcus complaining that tech companies were ruining law, and wondered what he would say if he knew his failure little sister was one of the people building that future. If he knew that while he'd been sending me job postings and telling me to call him when I had a real job, I'd been creating something that was actively reshaping the industry he'd spent his entire adult life trying to master. And I didn't feel triumphant exactly. Didn't feel the pure vindication I'd imagined in my darkest moments when his words had cut the deepest. But I felt something else, something quieter and more solid. The certainty that I'd been right to trust myself when no one else would, right to build something new instead of forcing myself into a mold that would have slowly killed everything original and creative inside me. And that night, I stayed late at the office looking at our client dashboard and our revenue projections and our growth metrics. And I thought about how success wasn't actually about proving your family wrong. It was about proving yourself right. But I couldn't deny that knowing Marcus was struggling while I was thriving added a sharp edge to that success, made it taste like justice, even though I knew that was petty and small. And I let myself feel it anyway, because after 2 years of mockery and dismissal and being treated like the family embarrassment, I'd earned the right to acknowledge that the tables had turned in ways none of them could have predicted. The email from Forbes arrived on a Tuesday morning in late August, exactly 24 months after I'd walked away from Columbia Law, and the subject line read, Forbes 30 Under 30 Legal Tech Interview Request. And I stared at it for a full minute before my hands started shaking enough that I had to set down my coffee. Because I'd seen the 30 Under 30 lists every year, had watched them feature founders and innovators who seemed to exist in a different stratosphere from where I'd been operating. And the email explained that I'd been selected as number 3 on this year's legal tech list, and they wanted to do a full profile including photos and an in-depth interview about LegalEase and my journey. And when I called Jen into my office and showed her the email, she actually screamed loud enough that our entire team of 12 employees looked up from their desks in alarm. And the interview happened 2 weeks later in our Long Island City office with a photographer who spent an hour getting shots of me at my desk and in front of our technology displays. And the reporter, a woman named Catherine Chen, who specialized in legal industry coverage, asked questions that went deeper than any interview I'd done before, wanted to know about my decision to leave Columbia, about the early struggles, about our technology and business model and vision for the future, and I found myself telling her the truth, about the family dinner where I'd announced I was quitting law school, about the months of ramen and rejection, about the moment I'd signed our first major contract and realized this was actually going to work. And Catherine asked about our current valuation, and I told her we'd just completed a Series A extension that put us at $25 million. And she asked about revenue, and I said we were on track for $3.2 million this year, with projections of $8 million next year. And I watched her write these numbers down and thought about how they would have been incomprehensible to the version of myself who'd been crying in that Queen's studio apartment 2 years ago. And the article went live on a Wednesday morning in mid-September, and Jen texted me the link at 6 a.m. before I'd even gotten out of bed, and I opened it on my phone and saw my face staring back at me from the Forbes website. Professional photo with the New York skyline behind me through our office windows. And the headline read, How Elena Rodriguez Left Law School to Build a $25 million Legal Tech Company. And below it was the number 3 ranking on the 30 Under 30 Legal Tech list. And the article was extensive, maybe 1,200 words, detailing my background at Columbia, my decision to leave despite family pressure, the development of LegalEase's AI-powered contract review technology, our major clients and funding rounds, and there in black and white was everything I'd built while my family had been dismissing me and mocking me and waiting for me to fail. And within an hour of the article going live, my phone started exploding with notifications, texts from investors and clients and people I'd gone to law school with, LinkedIn messages from lawyers and entrepreneurs and reporters, emails from potential clients and people wanting to schedule calls, and Sophia sent me a string of celebration emojis, followed by, You're literally in Forbes. And Jen posted the article to our company Slack, and our entire team was congratulating me, and by noon the article had been shared hundreds of times in legal tech circles, was trending on legal industry Twitter, had been picked up by several other publications as a notable story about innovation in law, and I sat at my desk refreshing my phone and watching the numbers climb and feeling something surreal wash over me because this was undeniable proof, permanent internet record, that I'd been right and everyone who doubted me had been wrong. And I waited for my phone to light up with my mother's number, or my father's, or even Marcus's, kept checking to see if anyone in my family group chat had mentioned it. But as the day stretched into evening, and the article continued to spread, and my inbox continued to overflow with messages from everyone except the people who'd known me longest, there was only silence from the Rodriguez family, and that silence was somehow louder than any congratulations could have been, and I went to sleep that night with my phone on my nightstand, still showing the Forbes article with my face and my story and my success displayed for the world to see. And I wondered how long they could possibly pretend they hadn't seen it, how long they could maintain the fiction that I was still the failure they'd decided I was on that night 2 years ago when I told them I was leaving Colombia, and I fell asleep not with triumph, but with a strange hollow feeling, because the validation I'd once craved from them meant less now than it ever had before. But some small part of me still waited for them to acknowledge what I'd become. My mother's call came on Saturday morning, 3 days after the Forbes article went live, and I was sitting at my desk in the office even though it was the weekend, because I'd been working on our Series B pitch deck when my phone lit up with her name, and for a moment I just stared at it, watching it vibrate against the wood surface, while my heart did something complicated in my chest. And I almost didn't answer because part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, wanted to make her wait the way she'd made me wait for 2 years of silence and dismissal. But I picked up on the fourth ring and said, "Hello?" And my mother's voice came through with that particular tone she used when she was trying to sound casual about something that clearly wasn't casual at all. And she said, "Elena? Hi, sweetheart. I was just thinking about you and wanted to check in, see how you're doing." And the words check in sat wrong in my mouth, because she hadn't checked in when I was eating ramen for every meal, or when I was coding until 3 a.m., or when I'd signed my first major contract. And I said, "I'm good, Mom. Working on some presentations for investor meetings." And there was a pause where I could hear her breathing, and I knew she'd seen the Forbes article, knew that everyone in the family and probably everyone they knew had seen it. And she said, "That's wonderful, honey. You always were so dedicated." And the revision of history was so blatant that I actually had to close my eyes for a moment. And then my father's voice came on the line, and I realized I was on speakerphone, and he said, "Elena, your mother and I have been talking, and we wanted you to know how proud we are of what you've accomplished." And his tone was completely different from the last time we'd spoken, when he'd called me irresponsible for leaving Colombia, when he'd told me I was wasting the opportunities they'd given me. And now he was saying, "We always knew you had potential, always knew you'd figure out your path." And I sat there in my empty office with the Saturday morning sun coming through the windows, and listened to them rewrite the narrative, listened to them pretend they'd been supportive all along. And my mother said, "We saw that nice article about you. Several people sent it to us, and we're just so excited to see you doing well." And she still couldn't bring herself to say Forbes, or acknowledge the magnitude of what the feature meant. And my father said, $25 million is quite impressive. You've clearly built something valuable." And the word valuable, coming from him, hit differently than it would have from anyone else. Because for 2 years, the implication had been that what I was building had no value, that I had no value outside of the conventional path they'd wanted me to follow. And I found myself giving them polite responses, saying thank you, and I appreciate that, without engaging deeply, without opening myself up to them the way I would have 2 years ago when I was desperate for their approval. And we talked for maybe 10 minutes about surface-level things, about the company's growth and my team and the office space, and my mother asked if I was eating well and sleeping enough with the same concerned tone she'd used when I was a child, as if the 2 years of silence hadn't happened, as if she hadn't cried at the dinner table when I'd announced I was leaving law school like I'd told her someone had died, and when we finally hung up after promising to talk again soon. I sat there holding my phone and feeling something that was equal parts validation and sadness, because I'd gotten what I'd once wanted, the acknowledgement from them that I'd made the right choice, but it had come so late and felt so conditional that it couldn't give me what it would have meant 2 years ago, and I realized that the hollowness I felt wasn't disappointment exactly, but rather the recognition that I'd already moved past needing their approval, that I'd built my sense of worth on a foundation that didn't include them. And while part of me was glad they'd called, another part of me understood that this call wasn't really about being proud of me. It was about them repositioning themselves in relation to my success. And that understanding made the validation feel like something I was observing from a distance rather than something that could touch the core of who I'd become. Marcus's call came 4 days after my parents', and his name appearing on my phone screen triggered a complicated knot of emotions that I couldn't quite untangle. Because this was the brother who'd laughed at me when I'd announced I was leaving Colombia, who'd sent me job postings with condescending messages about coming to my senses, who'd spent 2 years treating my choice like an extended joke that would eventually reach its punchline when I admitted defeat. And now his voice on the other end of the line was warm and congratulatory as he said, "Elena, hey, I saw the Forbes piece. That's really incredible. Congratulations." And I said thank you carefully, waiting for the other shoe to drop, because I'd learned that nothing with Marcus was ever straightforward. And we talked for a few minutes about the article and the company's growth, and he asked surprisingly informed questions about our technology and our client base. And I found myself relaxing slightly, thinking maybe he was genuinely trying to bridge the gap between us. Maybe the Forbes feature had made him see me differently, but then his tone shifted in that subtle way it always did when he was moving into negotiation mode. The lawyer voice that I recognized from family dinners where he'd talk about his cases. And he said, "So I've been thinking, my firm is really starting to explore tech solutions for our contract management. We're realizing we need to modernize our processes." And I felt my shoulders tense because I suddenly knew exactly where this was going, and he continued. "I mentioned your company to some of the senior partners, and they're really interested in what you're doing. I think there could be a great opportunity for us to work together on this." And the phrase "work together" sat wrong in the air between us, because what he meant was that he wanted me to give his firm special treatment, wanted to leverage our family connection for professional advantage after spending 2 years pretending that connection meant I should abandon what I was building. And I said, "That's great that your firm is interested in legal tech solutions, Marcus. You should have your partners reach out through our official channels. Our sales team handles all new enterprise inquiries." And there was a pause that stretched just long enough for me to hear his surprise. And he said, "Well, sure. But I figured since we're family, we could maybe discuss the parameters first. I could get you in front of the right people. Maybe we could structure something that works well for both sides." And I understood that "works well for both sides" meant he wanted a discount or special terms, or to be positioned as the person who'd brought in this valuable contract, wanted to take credit for connecting his firm to the sister he'd mocked. And I kept my voice professional, and even as I said, "I appreciate you thinking of us, Marcus, but we have a standard process for enterprise clients. We've found it works best to keep everything formal and consistent. If your partners are interested, they can email our enterprise team and we'll set up a proper presentation." And his tone shifted again, cooler now, with an edge of irritation as he said, "I'm trying to help you here, Elena. These are major players, the kind of client that could really validate your business." And the irony of him telling me I needed validation after Forbes had literally validated my business in front of the entire legal industry wasn't lost on me. And I said, "I understand, and we'd love to work with your firm if we're a good fit, but we need to go through proper channels." And we talked for another minute in increasingly awkward exchanges before he said he had to go to a meeting, and we hung up. And I sat there staring at my phone thinking about how he'd called me not to genuinely congratulate me or repair our relationship, but to position himself to benefit from what I'd built without him. And when I told Jen about the conversation later that afternoon, she actually laughed and said, "So let me get this straight. He spent 2 years telling you to get a real job, and now he wants you to give his firm a sweetheart deal? And we both sat there in my office, noting the irony that my technology was exactly the kind of innovation that was disrupting traditional law firms like his. That I'd become successful in part by solving the problems that firms like Marcus's were too slow to address themselves, and that now he wanted to use our family connection to get access to what I'd built while he'd been dismissing me. And the whole interaction left me feeling less angry than sad, because it confirmed what I'd already started to understand, that my family's sudden interest in my success wasn't really about me at all. The family group chat had been relatively quiet for most of 2 years. Messages flowing around me like I was a stone in a river that everyone had learned to navigate around. Occasional mentions of family events, or Marcus's latest achievement, or someone's birthday. And I'd stayed in the chat mostly out of inertia, not bothering to leave because doing so would have felt like admitting defeat, like confirming that I'd separated myself from them rather than the other way around. But on the Monday after Marcus's call, my phone started buzzing with notifications from that chat in a way it hadn't since before I'd left Colombia. And the first message was from Aunt Patricia, the same woman who'd called me irresponsible at that family dinner 2 years ago, who'd said I was throwing away my future and disappointing my parents. And her message read, "So proud of our Elena," with 3 heart emojis and a link to the Forbes article. And I sat there staring at those words, "Our Elena," like they were written in a foreign language, because I hadn't been their Elena when I was eating ramen and coding until dawn, hadn't been their Elena when I was pitching investors and getting rejected and trying again. And then the messages started flooding in. Uncle Roberto saying, "Amazing accomplishment, always knew you had it in you." And my cousin Michelle writing, "Congratulations, Elena. This is so inspiring." And various aunts and uncles and cousins I hadn't heard from in months or years suddenly appearing in that chat to tell me how proud they were, how excited they were for my success. And I scrolled back through the chat history to the message I'd sent 18 months ago with the TechCrunch article, the small write-up that had meant so much to me at the time, and I looked at how no one had responded to it, how the next message had been Uncle Roberto asking if anyone wanted to go in together on Mets tickets, like I hadn't said anything at all. And now these same people were filling the chat with congratulations and pride. And then the tone started shifting as more people joined in, and my cousin Daniel, who was 29 and had been unemployed for the better part of a year, wrote, "Hey Elena, this is so cool. Are you guys hiring? I'd love to learn more about what you're doing." And Aunt Patricia's husband sent a message saying, "My nephew just graduated with a business degree and is looking for opportunities. Would love to connect him with you." And Uncle Roberto asked, "What kind of investment opportunities are available at your stage, Elena? I've been looking to diversify." And I watched these messages accumulate on my screen, each one a small request wrapped in congratulations, each person suddenly seeing me not as the family disappointment, but as a resource to be tapped. And I thought about responding, thought about typing something polite and non-committal, but instead I just put my phone down and went back to work on the investor deck I'd been preparing. And throughout the day, my phone kept buzzing with more messages. More congratulations mixed with more requests, and Jen came into my office around 3 in the afternoon and said, "You okay? You seem distracted." And I showed her the group chat and watched her scroll through the messages with an expression that shifted from amusement to disgust. And she said, "These are the same people who ignored you for 2 years?" And I nodded, and she handed my phone back and said, "You don't owe them anything. You know that, right?" And I did know that. Had learned it over the past 2 years when I'd built my sense of worth on a foundation that didn't include their approval. But seeing their messages still triggered something complicated in me. A mixture of vindication that they finally saw what I'd accomplished, and sadness that their recognition came only now when I'd proven myself in terms they understood. And I didn't respond to any of the job inquiries or investment questions, just let them sit there in the chat unanswered. Because I'd learned that silence could be its own kind of response, and that evening Sophia texted me privately, "The group chat is insane, everyone suddenly acting like they always supported you." And I replied, "I noticed." And she sent back, "My mom literally told me last month that you'd probably have to get a real job soon, and now she's in there acting proud." And I sent her a laughing emoji, even though I didn't really find it funny. Found it more confirming of what I'd already known, that my family's love and pride had always been conditional on success they could recognize and claim as their own. My mother's call came on a Wednesday afternoon 3 weeks after the Forbes article, when I was in the middle of reviewing our Q3 projections with our CFO, and I almost didn't answer because I'd learned that conversations with her required emotional energy. I couldn't always spare in the middle of a workday, but something made me excuse myself and take it. And her voice was bright in that particular way that meant she wanted something as she said, "Elena, sweetheart, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." And I said, "I have a few minutes. What's up?" And she launched into talking about my father's upcoming 60th birthday, how they were planning something special at Oriole in Manhattan, that beautiful restaurant with the wine tower that I'd been to once for a family celebration back when I was still the disappointing daughter rather than the Forbes featured entrepreneur. And she said, "We'd really love for you to be there. It's going to be a nice gathering, family and some of your father's close friends and colleagues, very intimate, about 40 people." And I felt myself tensing because 40 people wasn't intimate, and the way she emphasized colleagues suggested this wasn't just a family dinner. And she continued, "Your father would be so happy to have you there. And honestly, Elena, I think it might be nice for you to share a little bit about what you've been doing. Everyone's been asking about you since that article." And there it was, the real reason for the call. Not just an invitation, but a request that I perform my success for their guests, that I validate their parenting by demonstrating how well their daughter had turned out despite their lack of support. And I said carefully, "When is it?" And she told me it was 3 weeks away on a Saturday evening, and I said, "I'll check my calendar and let you know." And she said, "Oh, please try to make it work. It would mean so much to your father." And then her voice shifted slightly as she added, "Marcus will be there, of course. He's bringing some colleagues from his firm. I think they're excited to meet you, actually." And that detail landed wrong, the mention of Marcus bringing colleagues to a family birthday party. And I felt the first flutter of suspicion that this was more than just a celebration, that something was being orchestrated. But I told my mother I'd be there, and she sounded genuinely pleased when we hung up, and I sat in my office for a few minutes after the call trying to decode what I'd just agreed to. And when I told Jen about it later, she immediately said, "It's a setup. They're going to try to use the party to put you in some situation where you can't say no to something." And I thought she might be being paranoid, but I couldn't quite shake the feeling that she was right. And that evening, Sophia texted me, "Did your mom call you about the birthday party?" And I replied, "Yeah, I'm going." And she sent back, "Be careful. I overheard my mom and yours talking last week, and they were planning something." I couldn't hear all of it, but they kept saying it would be perfect timing. And I asked her what she thought they were planning, and she said she didn't know, but that I should maybe bring backup. And I decided that if this was going to be some kind of ambush, I wasn't walking into it alone. So I asked Jen if she'd come with me as my +1, and she immediately said yes, said she wouldn't miss it for anything. And as the party date approached, I found myself feeling less anxious and more curious about what exactly my family had planned, because whatever it was, I was walking in with 2 years of success behind me and my best friend beside me, and I wasn't the same person who'd cried in her car outside a Thanksgiving dinner anymore. Oriole occupied a corner space in Midtown that managed to feel both grand and intimate. The kind of restaurant where birthday parties for 60th birthdays cost more than I'd spent on rent during my first 6 months in Queens. And Jen and I arrived 15 minutes after the invitation time because I'd learned from my startup experience that being strategically late gave you information about the room before you had to commit to a position. And the hostess directed us to a private room on the second floor, where I could already hear the murmur of conversation and laughter, and I paused at the entrance for just a moment, taking in the scene. 40 people as my mother had promised, round tables arranged around a central space where my father stood talking with a group of men in expensive suits, and the lighting was that perfect golden warmth that made everyone look successful and important. And I was wearing a navy theory dress that had cost me $800 and fit like it had been made for me, with Louboutin heels that added 3 inches to my height, and I'd had my hair professionally done that morning, and wore the Cartier watch I'd bought myself after closing our Series A, and Jen was beside me in a black cocktail dress looking equally polished, and we walked in together, and I watched the ripple of recognition move through the room as people noticed me, and my mother spotted me first, and her eyes widened slightly, taking in my appearance before she recovered and came over with her arms extended, saying, "Elena, you look beautiful. I'm so glad you made it." And she hugged me, and I hugged her back, and caught my father's eye across the room, and he nodded at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. And then I was surrounded by relatives I hadn't seen since before the Forbes article, and Uncle Roberto clasped my shoulder and said, "Elena, congratulations on everything, truly amazing." And I thanked him and introduced Jen as my business partner and friend, and Aunt Patricia appeared with her husband and said, "You look wonderful, so professional. We were just saying we need to hear all about your company." And I smiled and said something polite and non-committal, and my cousin Michelle asked if I was hiring for marketing positions, and I said we were always looking at strong candidates and gave her our general hiring email, deflecting without outright refusing, and I noticed how different this felt from Thanksgiving 2 years ago when I'd been invisible in the corner, how now I was the center of attention, but it felt performative rather than genuine, like they were all auditioning for my approval rather than offering authentic connection. And then Sophia appeared at my elbow and hugged me and whispered, "You look amazing. They're all freaking out." And I squeezed her hand gratefully, and over Sophia's shoulder, I saw Marcus in the far corner of the room, talking intensely with three men in suits who had that particular corporate attorney look about them, expensive but conservative. And he was gesturing as he spoke, and one of the men was nodding seriously, and something about the scene made my instincts fire warning signals. And Jen followed my gaze and leaned close to murmur, "That doesn't look like casual party conversation." And I agreed, but we were pulled into more greetings and small talk as various relatives cycled through wanting their moment with the newly successful family member, and I kept one eye on Marcus and his suited companions while maintaining my gracious public face. And I thought about Sophia's warning text, and my mother's carefully casual mention of Marcus bringing colleagues, and I understood with sudden clarity that whatever was about to happen had been planned and orchestrated, and I felt myself shift into the mental space I occupied during investor pitches, alert and strategic and ready for anything. Dinner was served at 7:30, and we were all seated at our assigned tables when my father stood up holding a champagne flute, and the room quieted immediately in that way that happens when someone commands natural authority, and he began by thanking everyone for coming to celebrate with him, talking about how 60 years had given him perspective on what mattered most in life. And it started innocently enough with anecdotes about his childhood and his career and his marriage to my mother, and people laughed at the appropriate moments, and I felt myself start to relax slightly, thinking maybe I'd been paranoid about the whole evening. But then his tone shifted as he said, "And of course the greatest joy of my life has been watching my children grow and succeed." And I felt Jen's hand find mine under the table and squeeze once in warning. And my father continued, "Marcus has built an impressive career at Hartwell and Associates, making junior partner at 32, following in the footsteps of excellence." And Marcus nodded humbly from his table while people applauded. And then my father's gaze landed on me, and he said, "And Elena, who took an unconventional path." And the way he said unconventional made it sound like a polite word for reckless, but who has found her own version of success with her technology company. And there was a smattering of applause, but I could feel the energy in the room shift, could sense that we were building towards something, and my father raised his glass and said, "To family, and to supporting each other in all our endeavors." And everyone drank, and I lifted my glass to my lips, but barely sipped. And as my father sat down, Marcus stood up, and I felt my entire body tense, because this wasn't normal birthday party protocol, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next was the reason I'd been invited. And Marcus smiled at the room and said, "I hope you'll indulge me for just a moment on my father's birthday, because I have some exciting news that involves the whole family." And he gestured to the three men in suits who I'd noticed earlier, and they stood as well. And Marcus said, These are my colleagues from Hartwell and Associates, and we've been working on something special. And he turned to look directly at me, and his smile was triumphant, in a way that made my stomach drop, and he said, Elena, we've been incredibly impressed with what you've built with LegalEase. And after extensive discussions with our board and our technology committee, Hartwell and Associates would like to make a formal offer to acquire your company. And the room erupted in surprised murmurs and excited chatter, and I sat frozen as Marcus continued. We think this is a perfect opportunity to keep innovation in the family and to help you take LegalEase to the next level with the resources and reach of an established firm behind you. And one of the suited men stepped forward and said, We're prepared to make a very competitive offer. And Marcus added, We can discuss specific numbers privately, of course, but we wanted to make the offer here, tonight, surrounded by family, because that's what this is really about, keeping it in the family. And he looked around the room with an expression that invited everyone to share in this beautiful moment. And I saw my mother's face lit up with hope and pride, and my father nodding approvingly, and various relatives leaning forward eagerly, and Aunt Patricia actually clasped her hands together like she was watching a marriage proposal. And the pressure in the room was enormous, the expectation that I would be grateful and excited, and would of course say yes to this generous offer from my successful brother, who was finally extending a hand to help his struggling little sister. And I felt Jen's hand squeeze mine again, and I knew she was waiting to see how I would handle this ambush. And Sophia caught my eye from across the room, and her expression was worried. And I took a breath and stood up, and the room went completely silent, waiting for my response. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence build and feeling the weight of 40 pairs of eyes on me, waiting for my gratitude and my acceptance. And I could feel Jen's steady presence beside me, and Sophia's worried gaze from across the room. And I looked at Marcus with his confident smile and his 3 colleagues standing behind him like reinforcements. And I looked at my father's expectant face and my mother's hopeful expression. And I thought about every single moment over the past 2 years when I could have used their belief and their support. And I smiled and said, Marcus, I want to thank you and your colleagues for your interest in LegalEase. And I kept my voice warm and professional. And I saw him start to relax, thinking I was about to accept. And I continued, It's always flattering when established firms recognize the value of what we're building, but I'm going to have to decline. And the room went very still, and Marcus's smile froze, and one of his colleagues shifted uncomfortably, and I kept going before anyone could interrupt. LegalEase has received multiple acquisition offers over the past 6 months, including from firms that have valued us at $50 million, and we've declined all of them because we're not interested in selling. We're building for the long term. And I watched Marcus's face go from confident to confused to red as he realized his offer had been dramatically lower than our actual market value, and I said, In fact, we're currently in the process of closing our Series B funding round. $15 million at a $75 million valuation, and we have term sheets from 3 top-tier venture capital firms. And the room was completely silent now, and I could see relatives doing the math in their heads trying to understand what those numbers meant. And my father cleared his throat and said, Elena, surely you would give family first priority. This is an opportunity to work together. And his tone had that edge of command that had always made me comply when I was younger. But I wasn't that person anymore, and I turned to him and said, Dad, I appreciate the sentiment, but this is a business decision, and Hartwell's offer doesn't align with our growth strategy or our valuation expectations. And I looked back at Marcus and his colleagues and said, If Hartwell and Associates is interested in becoming a customer, we'd be happy to discuss our enterprise solutions. We have several major firms already using our platform with excellent results. And I said it kindly, but the implication was clear that they could pay full price like everyone else, and Marcus's face was now fully red and he said, Elena, I think you're making a mistake. You don't understand how the legal industry works. You need established partners. And I smiled and said, Actually, Marcus, I think I understand exactly how the legal industry works, which is why 37 major firms are currently using our platform and our annual recurring revenue is over $2 million. And I let that number hang in the air for a moment, and Aunt Patricia gasped audibly, and Uncle Roberto whispered something to his wife, and my mother's mouth had fallen slightly open, and I looked around the room at all these people who had spent 2 years dismissing me and doubting me, and I said, I built LegalEase from nothing, in a studio apartment in Queens, eating ramen and coding 16 hours a day, and I did it without family support, or family money, or family connections, and now we're disrupting the entire legal tech industry. And my voice was steady and calm, and I felt more powerful than I ever had in my life, and I said, so thank you, Marcus, for the offer, truly. But I'm not interested in being acquired by anyone, and especially not in a surprise ambush at Dad's birthday party. And I sat back down and picked up my water glass and took a sip while the room erupted in shocked murmurs, and Marcus stood there looking like he'd been slapped, and Jen leaned over and whispered, that was perfect. And across the room, Sophia was trying not to smile, and I knew that everything was about to change. The silence after my declaration lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity before the room exploded into chaos. And my father stood up again. His face flushed and said, Elena, I think we need to have a private conversation. But I shook my head and said, no, Dad. I think we need to have this conversation right here, right now, because this whole evening has been a public performance, and I'm done pretending. And my mother reached for my father's arm, trying to calm him, but I could see tears starting in her eyes, and I stood up fully and looked around the room at all these faces that I'd known my entire life, and I said, for 2 years this family mocked me, ignored me, and told me I was failing. And my voice was steady and clear and carried to every corner of that private dining room, and I looked directly at Marcus and said, my own brother sent me job postings with notes that said, for when you come to your senses, and told me to call him when I had a real job. And Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but I kept going, and I turned to my parents and said, at Thanksgiving 2 years ago, I sat at that table and listened to Dad make comments about real careers and real success while everyone celebrated Marcus's promotion, and Mom, you didn't ask me a single question about my life. And my mother's tears were falling now, and she said, Elena, that's not fair. We were worried about you. But I shook my head and said, no, you were embarrassed by me. There's a difference. And I pulled out my phone and opened it to the screenshots I'd kept all this time. And I said, I have messages from this family group chat, months of them, where you all discussed my failure like I wasn't even there. And I started reading. Cousin Daniel wrote, how long until Elena moves back home? And Aunt Patricia responded, I give it 6 months. She was never practical like Marcus. And Aunt Patricia's face went pale and she said, Elena, I never meant. But I cut her off and said, yes, you did mean it. You all meant it. And that's fine. You're entitled to your opinions. But don't pretend now that you always believed in me. And Uncle Roberto stood up and said, Elena, we're family. Families have disagreements, but we support each other. And I laughed, and it came out bitter, and I said, where was that support when I was eating ramen in a studio apartment in Queens? Where was it when I was coding 16 hours a day, trying to build something from nothing? Where was it at any point in the past 2 years when one encouraging word or one expression of belief would have meant everything to me? And the room was completely silent now, except for my mother's quiet crying. And then Sophia stood up from her table across the room and said, I believed in you. And her voice was clear and strong, and her parents both turned to look at her in surprise. And Sophia walked across the room to stand beside me, and she said, Elena gave me a chance when no one else did. She's been mentoring me for over a year. And I've been working as a paid intern at LegalEase for the past 8 months. And her mother gasped and said, Sophia, what are you talking about? And Sophia looked at her parents and said, I've been working for Elena's company, learning the business, and I'm leaving State College to work for her full time. And her father stood up abruptly and said, absolutely not. You are not dropping out of college. But Sophia shook her head and said, I'm not asking permission. I'm 20 years old and I'm telling you what I've decided. and she looked at me and then back at her parents and said, Elena is offering me what none of you offered her, a real opportunity and actual belief in my potential. And I put my hand on Sophia's shoulder and looked at her parents and said, Sophia has been exceptional. She's smart and dedicated, and she has real talent for business development. And yes, I've offered her a full-time position with full benefits and a starting salary of $65,000. And I watched Sophia's parents' faces register shock at that number. And Sophia's mother said, Elena, you're putting ideas in her head. She needs to finish her education. But I said, Aunt Carmen, with respect, I'm not putting ideas in anyone's head. Sophia came to me because she saw that there are multiple paths to success, and she wanted to learn from someone who took a different route. And my father's voice cut through the chaos, and he said, This is exactly what I'm talking about, Elena. You're being selfish. You're disrupting this family. And something in me snapped at that word, selfish, and I turned to him and said, I'm being selfish? I built a company worth $75 million by myself, and now that it's successful, you want me to hand it over to Marcus's firm for less than it's worth and call it keeping it in the family? That's not family, Dad. That's exploitation. And my father's face went red, and he said, How dare you speak to me like that? And I said, How dare you ambush me at your birthday party with a business proposal designed to pressure me into making a bad decision? And we stood there staring at each other, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before, something that looked almost like fear, and I realized that he was afraid of me now, afraid of my success and my independence and my refusal to comply. And my mother stood up and came toward me and said, Elena, please, I always believed in you. You have to know that. And I looked at her and felt a wave of sadness, because I could see that she actually believed what she was saying, that she had rewritten the past 2 years in her mind to make herself the supportive mother. And I said quietly, Mom, 3 days after the Forbes article came out, you called me, and you couldn't even bring yourself to mention it directly. You just wanted to check in, remember? And she flinched, and I continued, If you had really believed in me, you would have called me 2 years ago when I left law school and told me you supported my decision, but you didn't. None of you did. And I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen just to make this moment more comfortable for everyone. The silence that followed my last words felt like it stretched across years rather than seconds, and I could see various relatives processing what I'd said, some looking ashamed and others looking defensive, and Uncle Roberto was the first to stand and approach me, his hands raised in a placating gesture, and he said, Elena, I think we all got caught up in worry. You have to understand, we only wanted what was best for you. And I looked at him and remembered the family barbecue where he'd asked loudly if I was still playing startup. And I said quietly, Uncle Roberto, wanting what's best for me would have looked like asking me about my business, offering encouragement, or even just not mocking me in the group chat. And he flinched and stepped back, and Aunt Patricia stood up next, and she was crying now, and she said, Elena, I'm sorry, I was wrong, I should have supported you. And I could see that her apology was genuine, that she actually felt remorse, and I nodded and said, Thank you, I appreciate that. And my mother was still crying, and she came to me and took my hands and said, Elena, please, I'm your mother. I've always loved you. I've always wanted you to succeed. You have to believe that. And I looked at her tear-stained face, and I felt such a complicated mix of emotions because I did believe she loved me. But I also knew that her love had been conditional on me following the path she understood. And I said, Mom, I know you love me, but love and belief are different things. And I needed you to believe in me even when you didn't understand what I was doing. And she squeezed my hands and said, I believe in you now. And I said gently, I know you do, now that there's proof, now that Forbes has validated me, now that there are numbers you can point to, but I needed you to believe in me when I had nothing but a dream and a laptop. And she started to respond, but my father's voice cut across the room and he said, Elena, this is ridiculous. You're being dramatic and you're making a scene at my birthday party. And I turned to look at him, and I realized that he still didn't get it. That he was more concerned about the embarrassment of this moment than about the 2 years of pain that led to it, And I said, Dad, you and Marcus ambushed me with a business proposal at your birthday party. You made this scene, not me. I'm just refusing to play along. And he said, I'm asking you to forgive us and move forward. That's what families do. And I pulled out my phone again and opened it to the screenshots I'd kept, hundreds of them. And I held it up and said, I kept these. Every single dismissive comment, every joke at my expense, every time someone in this family treated my dream like it was a joke. And I scrolled through them and said, I kept these to remind myself why I could never give up, why failure wasn't an option. Because I knew that if I failed, you would all say you were right, and I would never escape that judgment. And my voice broke slightly on those last words. And Jen put her hand on my arm, and I looked around the room and said, I don't want apologies that are motivated by my success. I don't want relationships based on what I can do for you. And I definitely don't want family members who ignored me for 2 years suddenly asking for jobs or investment advice or special deals. And I looked at Marcus and said, Your firm can become a customer if you want. At full enterprise pricing, no family discount, because LegalEase succeeds on the value we provide, not on family connections. And Marcus's face was dark with anger and he said, You're going to regret this, Elena. You're turning your back on your family. And Sophia spoke up from beside me and said, No, she's setting boundaries. There's a difference. And Marcus turned his anger on Sophia and said, And you, throwing away your education for some startup job, you're going to end up just like her, struggling and alone. And I felt Sophia stiffen beside me, and I said sharply, Sophia is not throwing anything away. She's choosing opportunity over obligation, and she won't be struggling because she'll be earning $65,000 a year with full benefits and learning skills that will serve her for life. And I looked at Marcus and said, And I'm not alone. I have Jen and Sophia and a team of incredible people who believe in what we're building. I have investors who trust me with millions of dollars. I have customers who depend on our technology. That's not alone, that's community. It's just not this family. And the room went completely silent at that, and I could see the impact of my words on various faces, some angry, some sad, some thoughtful. And my mother was crying harder now, and my father looked like he'd been struck. And I took a breath and said more calmly, I'm not cutting anyone off. I'm not disappearing. But going forward, my relationships with this family will be on my terms. I'll decide who I spend time with based on who genuinely cares about me as a person, not based on blood obligation or what I can provide. And I looked at each of them and said, If you want a relationship with me, a real one, then reach out and do the work. Apologize genuinely, show up consistently, prove that you value me for more than my success. But don't expect me to forget the past 2 years just because it's convenient now. And I picked up my purse and looked at Sophia and Jen and said, I think we're done here. And Sophia grabbed her coat and Jen stood up, and we walked toward the door while 40 people watched in stunned silence. And as we reached the exit, my mother called out, Elena, please don't leave like this. And I turned back and said, Mom, I love you. But I'm leaving exactly like this, because I finally have the strength to walk away from people who don't value me, even when those people are family. And then we walked out into the cool Manhattan night, and I felt like I could finally breathe. 3 months after I walked out of my father's birthday party, I stood in my corner office on the 23rd floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan and looked out over the city that had witnessed every moment of my struggle and my triumph. And the Series B funding round had closed 2 weeks earlier at $80 million, with Elena Rodriguez owning 43% of LegalEase, which meant that on paper I was worth $35 million, though I tried not to think about it in those terms, because the money had never been the point. The point had been proving to myself that I could build something meaningful, and Sophia walked into my office carrying 2 cups of coffee, and she set one on my desk and said, The team from Frankfurt is on in 10 minutes. And I smiled at her because she had absolutely flourished in the 3 months since leaving college. Her title was Junior Business Development Associate, but she functioned at a much higher level. And she had closed 2 major deals in her first 90 days, and the team respected her because she worked harder than anyone and never acted entitled despite being the founder's cousin. And I said, "How are your parents doing?" And Sophia made a face and said, "Mom calls every week asking when I'm coming back to school, but Dad has actually started asking about the business. I think he's coming around." And I nodded, because some family members had genuinely apologized in the months since the party. Aunt Patricia had written me a long letter taking full responsibility for her comments and asking for nothing in return. And Uncle Roberto had called and said simply, "I was wrong and I'm sorry." And I had cautiously begun rebuilding relationships with the relatives who showed genuine remorse and asked nothing of me. But my relationship with my parents remained strained. Though it was slowly improving, my mother called every Sunday now and we talked about real things, about my life and my company and my feelings, and she was learning to listen without trying to fix or control. And my father and I had met for coffee twice and he had apologized in his own limited way, saying, "I should have trusted your judgment," which wasn't quite the same as admitting he'd been cruel, but it was progress. And Marcus hadn't spoken to me at all since the party. I heard through Sophia that he was angry and embarrassed, and his firm had actually ended up licensing a competitor's technology at a higher price point. And I felt no satisfaction in that because I had never wanted him to fail. I had only wanted him to see me. And my phone buzzed, and I looked down to see a text from my mother asking if I wanted to come to Sunday dinner, and I realized that she was still trying, still showing up, still doing the work. And I texted back, "I'll be there," because forgiveness wasn't a single moment. It was a series of choices to keep showing up and building something new. And Jen knocked on my open door and walked in with a magazine and she said, "You need to see this." And she handed me the Wall Street Journal, and there on the front page of the technology section was an article titled, "How AI is Disrupting Big Law," with a photo of me standing in our office. And the article detailed LegalEase's technology and our rapid growth and quoted me extensively about the future of legal services. And Jen said, "We're going to get flooded with inquiries." And she was right because my phone started ringing immediately. And Sophia sat down in one of my office chairs and said, "I still can't believe this is real sometimes." And I understood what she meant because there were moments when I looked around at the office with 32 employees and the millions in revenue and the Wall Street Journal articles, and I felt like I was living someone else's life. But then I remembered the nights in Queens eating ramen, the hours of coding until my eyes burned, the family dinners where I was invisible, and I knew that this was real because I had built it line by line and day by day. And I walked over to my desk where I kept a framed photo that Jen had taken on her phone at my father's birthday party, a candid shot of me standing and speaking while the family watched. And Jen noticed me looking at it, and she said, "I still don't understand why you keep that. It was such an awful night." And I picked up the frame and looked at my own face in the photo, at the strength and clarity I saw there, and I said, "I keep it to remember that my worth was never about their approval. It was always about knowing my own value, even when no one else could see it." And Sophia looked at me and said, "That's why you gave me a chance, isn't it? Because you knew what it felt like to be unseen." And I nodded and said, "And because I saw in you what I saw in myself, someone willing to work for what they believe in." And my phone rang again, and I looked at the screen and saw it was an international number, and I answered, "Elena Rodriguez." And the voice on the other end said, "Miss Rodriguez, this is James Chen from Whitmore and Associates in Hong Kong. We're one of the largest international law firms in Asia, and we're very interested in discussing an enterprise contract for LegalEase." And I smiled and looked at Jen and Sophia who were watching me, and I said, "I'd be happy to discuss that. Let me connect you with our head of enterprise sales." And I transferred the call and sat down at my desk and thought about how far I'd come in 3 years from a miserable law student to the founder of a company that was changing an entire industry. And I realized that the little girl who had always felt second to Marcus, who had internalized the message that her worth depended on following the approved path, was finally free because I had proven to myself that I could create my own definition of success and whether my family ever fully understood that didn't matter anymore because I understood it. And that was enough. And Sophia's phone buzzed and she looked at it and laughed and said, "Mom just sent me the Wall Street Journal article with 3 exclamation points." And I smiled because that was progress too. Small moments of recognition, building into something that might eventually become acceptance. And Jen said, "We need to prepare for the Frankfurt call." And I stood up and grabbed my notebook and followed them to the conference room where my team was already gathering. And as I walked through the office, I saw the faces of the people who had believed in me and chosen to build this with me. And I thought about how I'd been so afraid 3 years ago that leaving law school meant losing everything. But actually, it had meant finding everything that mattered. And I sat down at the head of the conference table and opened my laptop and looked at the faces of my team on the video call from Germany. And I thought, this is just the beginning. And I smiled and said, "Good morning. Thank you for making time to meet with us today." And somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard my father's voice from 3 years ago saying I was wasting their money and throwing my life away. And I heard Marcus laughing and saying I'd come crawling back in 6 months. And I heard all the voices that had told me I was making a mistake. And then I heard my own voice, the one that had said I could do this, the one that had kept me going through every impossible moment. And I realized that voice had been right all along.